Sometimes the big headlines about global politics, they feel a bit too simple, right?
Yeah, they definitely gloss over the messy stuff.
Exactly, like they smooth out all the complicated realities happening, on the ground. Today, we're going to look past those headlines. We'll dig into how nations and people across Africa are actually reacting to some recent, pretty significant shifts in international relations, particularly involving the United States.
Okay.
So, we've gathered a stack of source material for this deep dive. We've got excerpts from recent reports, including like direct quotes and reactions from government officials, regular citizens, international organizations, all across different African countries.
Right.
And we've also got analysis looking at the shifting trade and aid dynamics. So our mission really is to dive into these sources and just surface the specific perspectives, the real impacts, and the strategic responses that are emerging from the continent itself.
Okay, let's unpack this. And the context the sources give us is absolutely key here. They paint a picture of a period where other global powers, France, China, Russia, are actively stepping up their game, increasing engagement, courting African nations. And this is often contrasted with what's described as a perceived U.S. stance under a specific administration. The reports frame it differently, sometimes like a withdrawal or even, antagonistic.
Yeah. And the first thing that really jumps out from these sources is just how specific U.S. rhetoric has landed. Let's start with the view from South Africa. We probably all remember those comments from a few years back, calling African countries shithole countries. And then more recently, these claims circulating about a white genocide supposedly happening there.
Oh, yeah. And it's fascinating how the sources capture the reaction to that. It's not just disagreement. It's outright mockery and really strong rejection coming from within South Africa itself.
Absolutely. We see quotes from citizens just dismissing the claims as crazy stupid.
Yeah.
People are quoted arguing that crime, it exists among all people. It's not racially motivated per se, and it's often, more prevalent in underprivileged areas. That's the argument presented.
And the view coming through is that this whole narrative is just inaccurate, fundamentally untrue, and actually harmful to South Africa's own efforts, their ongoing work towards social cohesion and reconciliation, especially given their difficult history.
And this wasn't just chatter on the street. The sources really highlight the South African police minister's very strong public statement. He called the genocide claim dangerous and twisted.
Strong words.
Yeah, and he went on to emphasize it's totally unfounded and totally unsubstantiated. Just flat out denied it.
And there's even a specific example the sources mention about a farming community protest. They use crosses, apparently symbolizing killings over many years.
Okay.
And the sources note these symbols were reportedly twisted to fit that false narrative about racially motivated crime. And here's a surprising detail one source mentions, that even white South Africans have reportedly, quote, laughed at the genocide accusation.
Wow, that detail. Yeah, that really shows the disconnect the sources are describing, doesn't it? Between these external narratives and what people are actually feeling and saying on the ground there.
Definitely.
Okay, so beyond that rhetoric, the sources also look at how South Africa handled official interactions. What did you find about President Ramaphosa's meeting in the Oval Office?
Well, according to the reports, South Africans seemed to rally behind President Ramaphosa's handling of that meeting. They seem to appreciate his approach.
And the sources point specifically to the strategic way he put his delegation together, right?
Exactly. It reportedly included the foreign minister from the opposition party, described in the source as a white guy, along with white golfers, and then people from his own party, too. A real mix. Yeah. And the source contrasts this delegation, presenting what it calls a cool, calm, collected, intelligent vision about trade, with the other party reportedly looking like an absolute lunatic. That's a pretty striking description from the source.
It really is. It kind of paints a picture of South Africa trying to project this, unified, competent, diverse front on the world stage. There's also a perspective, though, from a Johannesburg resident in the sources. They felt Ramaphosa handled the meeting well, but maybe missed an opportunity.
Right. This resident felt he perhaps could have given more historical context.
Yeah.
Things like struggle songs, like kill the boer, kill the farmer. Explain them as, chants rooted in their deep, and as the source says, ugly, ugly history, not literal calls for violence now.
Ah, okay. So navigating that complexity.
Yeah, it just highlights how tricky it is to manage both international relations and those domestic historical narratives at the same time.
Sure, sure. Okay, so we've seen how the rhetoric landed, how leadership tried to manage the narrative, but the sources also get into the very tangible uh, impacts of policy. Let's shift from words to economics and look at Botswana.
Absolutely. The sources highlight a very direct hit on Botswana because of U.S. trade policy. They point specifically to a 37% trade tariff imposed by the Trump administration on Botswana.
Wow, 37%. That's huge.
Yeah, and it describes Botswana as one of the hardest hit nations in Africa by these kinds of policies.
So, what was Botswana's reaction, according to the sources?
Well, the sources note Botswana's foreign minister, Fino Butele, specifically calling for more trade and investments with the EU in response. A clear signal.
That's a definite pivot. And what's the economic backdrop there? Diamonds, right?
Exactly. The sources mentioned Botswana's economy relies heavily on diamond exports. Apparently it contracted last year, but the forecast suggests some growth this year. So they're feeling the pinch of that tariff while also looking, to the future.
What really stands out here, I think, is how one specific trade policy decision by the U.S. seems to directly trigger another country, Botswana, a major diamond producer, to explicitly state its strategic intention to, quote, deepen bilateral trade and strategic partnership with the European Union. It's such a clear cause and effect described in the sources.
It really is. And this example from Botswana kind of fits into a broader trend the sources explore, which is how other global powers are stepping up their engagement, maybe filling spaces where the U.S. is perceived to be, well, stepping back. China comes up a lot in the reports.
Yes, definitely. We see Shenzhen, the director for West Asia and African Department at China's Ministry of Commerce. The sources say he's actively promoting the Belt and Road Initiative across Africa.
And the scale of China's economic presence described is, well, it's substantial. Annual direct investments from Chinese companies in Africa, consistently over $3 billion every year for the past 5 years. That's what the sources state.
$3 billion a year.
Yeah, and it spans a wide range of sectors, involves all sorts of different entities now, not just state-owned ones.
Yeah.
And there's even reported support for small and medium businesses, young entrepreneurs. It's quite broad.
And the sources use Kenya as a key example of this dynamic, right?
They do. Kenyan President William Ruto pledged closer ties to China during a recent visit. And the sources frame this quite clearly as Kenya looking towards Beijing and away from Washington. President Ruto also reportedly referenced a long history, mentioned a people-to-people relationship going back like 600 years, while the formal bilateral ties started in the 1960s. So he's grounding this current relationship in a much deeper historical context, according to the source.
Interesting. And the sources detail specific, tangible results of this China-Kenya cooperation, things that directly impact daily life and trade there. They mention key infrastructure, like the standard gauge railway.
Yeah, which has reportedly drastically cut cargo transit times. Big boost for trade and tourism, apparently.
And also the Nairobi Expressway, highlighted for cutting travel time significantly between the airport, the CBD, the suburbs.
Right. These aren't just abstract investments, are they? They're highly visible, functional projects that people use every day.
Exactly. And it's not just infrastructure. The sources mention agriculture, too. Kenya becoming a top supplier of avocados to China.
Which increases farmer earnings, yeah. And better market access for flour exports was noted, too, back in 2019, facilitating easier trade routes and reduced barriers.
And even education gets a mention. The Confucius Institute at the University of Nairobi promoting language learning, cultural exchange.
So when you put all of that alongside the context mentioned earlier in the sources, things like the reported destruction of USI or the U.S. pulling out of the World Health Organization, the sources suggest this creates an opening.
Right.
An opening that China is reportedly and quite visibly filling with these broad, tangible kinds of engagements.
Right. So this perceived U.S. shift, it isn't just about diplomacy or rhetoric. It has these really tangible impacts on aid structures, on international organizations, too. The sources discuss this, and they bring in the perspective of the WHO Director General, Tedros Ghebreyesus.
Yeah, he describes the consequences of reduced U.S. involvement pretty starkly. Specifically talks about sudden and steep cuts to bilateral aid, which apparently caused severe disruption in at least 70 countries. That's a lot of places.
And the specific impacts he details, they're quite grim, according to the sources. Patients missing treatments, health facilities actually closing down.
Health workers losing jobs.
Yeah, and people facing increased out-of-pocket health costs. I mean, that's a direct human cost described right there in the reports.
It is. It's clearly a significant challenge. But interestingly, the sources also present this dual perspective. While it's difficult, some countries reportedly see this as an opportunity, maybe.
An opportunity. How so?
An opportunity to reduce dependency, maybe accelerate a transition towards self-reliance, based on their own domestic resources.
Huh. That's an interesting way to frame it, turning a challenge into a push for more independence.
Kind of, and the WHO itself is reportedly responding. Member countries are expected to agree to raise their annual contributions by 20%. The idea is to bolster WHO finances and lessen that reliance on voluntary funding, like from single large donors.
Okay, so internal strengthening too.
And the sources also bring in another perspective, this one from the Center of Studies of Africa via Anthony Busang, looking at how all this impacts the global trade ecosystem more broadly.
Okay, what's the take there?
They describe a shift away from, a multilateral system towards what's characterized as a more unilateral and isolationist kind of system, basically protectionist trade policy.
Right.
And according to this view, while maybe some benefit, the broader impact is far-reaching, especially hitting less developed economies in Africa pretty hard. The source states the effect of base and reciprocal tariffs will really be high on these economies.
So needing cooperation, not isolation.
Exactly. The source really emphasizes the need for global cooperation, arguing against more isolationism. It advocates for an integrated approach to trade that benefits all nations, which, echoes what we heard about Botswana looking for alternatives when faced with those tariffs.
It does, yeah. And that highlights the African Union's strategic response, too, which the sources detail, actively strengthening relationships with other blocs.
Right, especially the European Union. The sources highlight this acceleration of cooperation between the EU and the African Union.
Yeah, they mention a meeting of EU and AU foreign ministers, pledging to boost cooperation on peace, security, and their economy, and stressing the, quote, urgency of moving from commitments to implementation. Sounds like they want action.
Definitely. This came out of the third ministerial EU-AU meeting mentioned in the source material.
And the key outcomes reported from that meeting, they're pretty significant, aren't they?
Yeah, both sides reaffirming commitments to things like strengthening multilateralism and international cooperation, preserving international law, increasing the inclusiveness and effectiveness of multilateral institutions like the UN for peace and security.
And on the economic side,
Similar commitments. Strengthening economic ties, promoting integrated, resilient markets, encouraging investment for inclusive growth, opportunities across both continents.
and this is all happening when?
Well, this is explicitly noted in the sources as happening at a time when the United States is perceived as withdrawing. So it looks like a very conscious, strategic move by African nations in the EU to strengthen their partnership in this changing global landscape.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together then, from the sources, we have these strong reactions in African nations to specific U.S. rhetoric and policies. We have these very real, tangible, negative impacts, aid cuts, tariffs, and then this clear pivot by some nations, and the African Union as a whole, towards deepening strategic partnerships with other global powers and blocs, like China and the EU. So what does this all mean for you listening to this deep dive?
Well, I think it paints a picture of African nations really asserting their perspectives, feeling the direct effects of policy shifts happening elsewhere, but also actively, strategically recalibrating their international relationships in response. They aren't just passive bystanders here. They're clearly acting.
What stands out to you in these specific examples we've pulled from the sources? How do these reactions, these policy shifts, these strategic partnerships, how do they illustrate the larger changes happening on the global stage? Changes that maybe don't always make the main headlines?
Yeah, it's a good question. When you look closely at these detailed examples from South Africa, Botswana, Kenya, and then the broader movements by the WHO, the African Union, it really feels like these could be early indicators of a pretty fundamental reshaping of global alliances and power dynamics. The sources lay out the pieces, right? The rhetoric, the policies, the reactions, the new partnerships. And while they don't spell out some grand conclusion, the actions and reactions they describe, they strongly imply this larger shift is underway.
Yeah.
What might the long-term map of international relationships actually look like if these trends continue? Definitely something for you to mull over.